Hey readers, happy almost Halloween. I figured that there are not a lot of really Halloween connected books on my reading list for this year, but there are a couple, so that is what I'm going to be reviewing right now. And before I get into this review, I do want to give a disclaimer, content warning thing. This is technically a children's book. This is technically a young adult. On the back, it says 12 and up for the recommended age, but it does deal with some really heavy themes, including cancer, loss of a parent, and sort of processing related to that whole experience, the treatment, the actual death, all of it. And so I did want to just disclaim that if that could be potentially something that you do not want to hear about. But this is my review of A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. I actually first read this for a Battle of the Books, I think in 7th grade or maybe 6th grade. I can't remember, but relatively young-ish, sort of like around the age that it says, like 12 and up. And this is also, it says that it was inspired by an idea from, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Siobhan Dowd. And it's interesting because I don't remember the full details, but I remember learning that the backstory is the inspired by person was starting this book and then I think died before finishing it. So it was taken on by the author who it's actually published under, Patrick Ness, who then finished it. And also it says on the back, this book is the first ever to win both the Carnegie Medal for Literature and the Kate Greenway Medal for Illustration, which I personally think it highly deserves both of those awards. Because the art in it is amazing, and it's definitely like a word heavy, it's not like a full picture book, but it is still a children's book and does still have a lot of pictures. And there's a particular one that is one that I have remembered since initially reading this book. It's this one, which kind of goes similarly with the cover here. And so this book is a really interesting book in my opinion because it kind of twists like monster in this sense of the title, because there is the literal creature monster, this guy, but then at the same time there is also the monster that is the illness in this plot as well, which the other thing I do want to say is this book is more powerful to me now because I have lost my grandma to cancer and my mom recently had cancer, but she recovered. And so reading it now is different than reading it when I didn't really have as much of a sense of what that is or was. This is another picture that I remember so much from back then. And I think that this is one of the pages where this is more like the monster, like the evil monster. Because what you find out through the course of this story is that that being is not necessarily malicious. And I don't think that's too much of a spoiler because it's very interesting because this creature who is kind of like an ent almost. It's like this being that is a tree, like part of a tree that comes walking from the hill to the boy's window. It is very interesting because it comes to his window and it always appears at the same time, and you'll understand why at the end of the book, but that is a spoiler, so I'm not going to say it. But it says, basically, I'm going to tell you 3 stories, and at the end you are going to tell me your truth. Which is very, very interesting, because it kind of is pushing the boy to sort of confront that truth himself that he's been sort of hiding even from himself. And I think this is a really good book dealing with exploration of family and sort of, I guess, shared trauma is the best way to put it. And it's just a very serious book for the age range that it's kind of targeting. Which is why I find it interesting that it was chosen as a Battle of the Books book when I was a lot younger. And I do think it is an amazing book, and I thought that back then, but I was also like, this is so depressing compared to the other books that were picked. And I think that that's kind of similar to the books that I'm reading this year. It's not really an upbeat book, but it is very good, and I do highly recommend it. And the other thing that I think is pretty cool about it is it was actually adapted into a movie, which I also saw in theaters when it came out. And when I saw it in theaters, I hadn't read it for a couple of years, but I remember, as far as I understand, it is a very loyal adaptation. I thought it was so good, and after having read it first, and then I've seen the movie, and then I read it again now, I do think the movie is very, very accurate. And I think it's accurate not only to the plot and the message and the storyline, but also to the design. Because if you look at all the pictures in here, there are certain things that look very specific and sort of have a very distinctive appearance. Like the monster being all branchy and everything like that. I think they did a really, really good job in the movie, and I definitely think that this is a book that I think it would be a good book for kids to read in like the age range it recommends if they're prepared for the subject matter. And also if they aren't experiencing something that's too close to it at the time, unless they think that that might be something that could actually help them cope and process. Because it is very viscerally written. And I think it's an amazing book for all ages, not super young, but like 12 and up, all ages. That I think anyone should read if they are interested in it. It is fiction, but it's definitely more like real world, serious issue rooted fiction. And I think it's also something where looking at it again after seeing the movie and after initially reading it when I was so young, the pictures I just appreciate so much more, like the depth of all of the pictures. They all have so much detail that I feel like you could spend multiple minutes on each page just looking at the pictures. And I think it's an interesting book because I feel like when I was reading stuff around this age, a lot of books didn't really have pictures anymore. At like the 12 and up reading level, you get a lot of chapter books, which this is a chapter book. But it's a chapter book with full page picture spreads. And so I think it's a really, really good book because, well, obviously other people think so too because it won the award for both literature and illustrations, and it's the first book to ever win both. So I think that that's very cool. But I also think that it's probably a good book if your child is reading it, for anyone out there who has children in this age range who may be reading it. I feel like it's a good book to discuss some of these more serious issues with, because it also has stuff about like broken families and sort of like repairing a damaged relationship through, or not even repairing a damaged relationship, but getting close to sort of an estranged relationship because of shared trauma or grief, I guess. And again, I'm trying not to give too many spoilers. It's not a very long book. I feel like I probably read this in maybe a couple days the first time I read this, and like maybe it wasn't all continuous, but probably like 5 or 6 hours when I just recently did it. It's 205 pages. And the last page is hard to read, but very good. And I think it's also just such an interesting book to sort of understand, sort of like it's hard to explain what I mean by this, but the way that like a childhood monster, this guy, is something that a kid may have to face more real world monsters than that, in a way where it's like this being isn't that scary anymore. Which I think the message of that is really interesting. And it's a little bit hard to explain too much of that without going into spoiler territory, which I'm trying not to do too much, especially because a lot of the stuff in this book, it is a little hard to talk about without getting into spoilers, but there's certain things that are very interesting, foreshadowing, symbolism, tons of stuff. So I definitely recommend it. I think it's definitely one where it's better to be prepared for what this book's content is before you go into it, which is why I did say some of the things about it, but most of those are things that you know pretty much right at the beginning. Not necessarily from page 1, but they either are not like the main plot spoilers, or they are things that is kind of like background information in the book. And I think it's also the story behind the authors, which again, I heard about it a while ago and I don't exactly remember, but how it was like taken over after the person who sort of originated the idea had died. I'm pretty sure that is correct for this book. But it is very, very interesting because I feel like there's a couple of different media or stories, not necessarily books, but I can think of several stage play musicals where something similar happened. I believe Rent, the original composer, died before it was realized, and then Be More Chill is a musical where it was based on a book, and the author of the book agreed for it to be turned into a stage play musical, but died before actually seeing that too. So I think that stories like that are interesting to see how the creators' real life kind of may affect or influence a story that's taken on by someone else. And I feel like there are also examples of times where that's done and the person who takes it on puts almost nothing of themselves into it. For example, when Tolkien's son published The Silmarillion, The Nature of Middle-earth, all the other books based on his father's notes, but pretty much kept it loyal to those notes and just basically edited them for clarity and understanding, versus something like this where it was more in the idea stage and then it was fully written into a cohesive story by someone else. So yeah, I think this is not necessarily like a horror book the way like Halloween monster type creepy story, as much as it is a very powerful book about different types of monsters, and the cryptidy tree creature thing may not be the monster. Maybe a disease is the monster. Maybe certain other things would be considered the monster. But I think it is a very good book. And I think also I love stories that explore the meaning of monster or other sort of terms like that, where it's like, is that the creature, or is that your own mind? Is it, in this case, like I said, a disease, or this scenario, or the nightmare? There's a nightmare that is not related to the monster character, that is a separate nightmare, which is, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that that nightmare is related to the protagonist's truth, that the monster demands that he tells him after the monster finishes his 3 stories. And it's the 3 stories also, I feel like, I don't want to say too much detail, because, again, they are very profound and very good, and I feel like if I say too much right now, it will kind of take away from that if you decide to read it yourself and get too much into spoiler territory. But the 3 stories all kind of have their own moral or like side to them that help prepare the protagonist for what's happening in his life. And I think by saying it that way, it's vague enough that it doesn't spoil too much, because they're not all about exactly the same thing, but they're all kind of about aspects of his life that's happening and sort of guiding him. And so in this book, I think it's interesting because the monster is almost more of like a guide, or I don't know if protector is the right word, because I feel like it's not really trying to shield or protect, but more like a teacher, or like a, it's not really a mentor either, but like making the protagonist confront his truth, as well as like preparing him for certain realities, in a way where it is not malicious, and it's trying to basically like strengthen the protagonist in a way, which I think is interesting because in a lot of stories with a so-called monster, it's trying to tear down the protagonist, attack the protagonist, get rid of the protagonist, harm the protagonist, do something malicious that is in some way against the protagonist. And I feel like the most you get of this is like pushing him to confront things he may not feel ready for or feel comfortable with, but in a way that needs to happen because of what's happening as well in the story. And so I feel like I have probably rambled on about this too much, but I genuinely really love this book. I think it is so powerful. It's hard to read because of the subject matter, and especially, like I said, for me now, that hits a little closer than it did the first time I read it, but it is genuinely an incredible book. It was so memorable to me because I read it for Battle of the Books. Like I said, I could not tell you a single other book that I read for that, even though my team read all 8 and multiple of us read all of them instead of just being like, I'll take 1 and you take 2. Like, I think I read all except maybe 1 that I didn't have time for. I could not tell you any of the others that I read because they just were nowhere near as memorable as this one. And I know in a Battle of the Books in like 5th grade or 6th grade, I can't remember, we read some book about baseball, but I don't know. I remember that one because I remember that they asked a really stupidly unfair question where it was like, on this page, what was the baseball card that and anyway, it's a very stupid question. But, like, I think that this book is genuinely one that's super memorable. Like I said, the pictures, I still remember, like, even before I read this, I was like, I remember that picture of him, like, looking in the window, leaning on the house, and I remember these other pictures that are so vivid, and I remember the time, like, the significant time in this. Even before rereading it, I remembered what that time was, and just, it's a really powerful book that sticks with you. And I remember when I saw it in the store, like, a few years ago, after pretty much not having thought of it for a while, I wasn't immediately like, I need to get this and reread it because it's good, it's powerful, and then I did not get around to it because school and stuff, so I got around to it now. But I love this book. I think it's definitely emotional. It's very, like I said, visceral, very powerful with the emotions, and also sort of the lessons. And not lessons in, like, a fable, sort of, like, kind of, the stories within the main story are kind of more the fables, but it teaches in a very uncondescending way. I feel like sometimes with children's books that are trying to convey, like, a really strong life lesson, it's sometimes put across in a way that's a little bit condescending, and I feel like that's more so for younger kids than necessarily like the 12-ish age range. But still, I've seen books in that age range too, where it's kind of like, the way this is worded sounds like you think all kids in that age range are stupid. And the way that this is written, it is written in a way where it's like, this is the reality some kids are facing with illnesses in their families or things like that. And I mean, I think most kids probably do not have a tree creature coming to their window, but it's such a well-written book that even if you don't have a connection to it necessarily from personal experience, it's very powerful. And when I went to the movie theater to watch the adaptation of this, I feel like by the end, or like probably like 3/4 to the end, I think almost everyone in the theater was crying. And I remember specifically there was like this really like buff gym rat type guy in there who's the type of guy that you would expect to be like the stoic, like, men don't cry, I'm this tough guy kind of persona. And he was just like straight out bawling in the theater. And I personally think that that's great. I think that having people who of any physicality or any gender identity being able to show emotion is really great. But I think it just goes to show like how much this book, and in that case movie, can affect someone, because I have no idea what that guy's like how much he related to this book, movie in that case, or like how much something about it connected or resonated or like brought something up for him or anyone else in the theater. But like everyone in the theater was super emotional, which I think goes to show that it is definitely very powerful. And I recommend that if you want to read it, also watch the movie, because like I said, it is actually a very good adaptation, and not all book to movie adaptations are good and loyal, and this one I think is. And it kind of makes me wonder if one of the reasons why it is so loyal is because it is so serious, and it knew the subject matter and the way it was presented and dealt with in the book is so delicate. And so maybe that's why they were so loyal, because they didn't want to take too many liberties and change the core of what this book is too much. But anyway, I think it's definitely a very good book. It's also a difficult book, but if it seems like something you would potentially enjoy, or not necessarily enjoy, but want to read, I definitely recommend it. And I think also, if you're interested, look into the story about the original idea, the person who had the original idea compared to like how it was written in the modern, or the author that took over it. And I think also, I don't remember for sure, but I think there was something in the movie where they like said something in tribute to the original person who had the idea, who, again, I don't know how to pronounce their first name, so I apologize if I said it wrong. But definitely an amazing book, and I highly recommend it. I felt like it was kind of the closest in theme, sort of, for like almost Halloween with the monster thing, even though it's not the conventional Halloween monster. But I think for sure have like comfort something when you read it. Have like hot chocolate or a nice cozy spot or something, because it is definitely, I think, for all the books I'm reading this year, again, some of them I have not read yet, but definitely so far it's the most difficult to read. And especially because the protagonist is so young, I think makes it more difficult, because he is a, not like super young, but like kind of around the age range that it says, like around 12 or something. I can't remember if it actually says what his specific age is, but I think he's like somewhere in the range of like 10 and 13. But I think he's in I think it also takes place in, for the most part, England. So I don't know exactly how their grades cross over to our year grades. But I think he's in sort of like the equivalent of middle school. But very powerful. Anyway, this has been a somewhat long review, so I'm going to end this here for now. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you're reading. Let me know if you have read this book. Again, being careful of spoilers in the comments. And keep reading. Bye!